Life on Earth is a legitimate issue. It's actually a problem. And it's a problem that the vast majority of people on this planet kind of ignore for one reason or another. I mean, the main reason why it's ignored is because either, you fall into one of two categories. You fall into either, say, an evolutionist perspective, or you fall into the religious side. Now, of course, both of those sides are essentially the two sides that dominate in the Western world, and both of those sides claim to know the answer to the basic question of where did life come from? Right? Where did humans come from? Here's your answer, sir. Right here. Here you go. Either God created us all miraculously, or, we evolved from some kind of a puddle of amino acids that magically, formed together to make you. And both sides are essentially complacent in this explanation. Both sides are fine with this, right? Because this satisfies one of the psychological problems, or one of the psychological situations that humans like to have solved, and that is the instant gratification problem. Right? So both the religious side and the evolutionist side give everybody a quick answer to a big problem. And once you have a good answer for something, most people will just move on. Because most people are not biological scientists. Nobody cares about genetics, DNA, all that stuff. They just want to know the answer. That's what's important. And that's the same thing for a religious person. A religious person is in the exact same mindset. It's just that they have a mystical God that creates them out of nothing. Right? So psychologically, the vast majority of the planet has been placated from this question. Now, the reason why I bring this up at all is because all of our ancestors, they all talk about, life and where life comes from on this planet. And as a side note, it's interesting to note that quite a lot of those cultures are aware that we are living on a planet, by the way. Now, that may or may not be for this discussion, but it's just something to think about. Anyway, so when we look at ancient cultures all over the planet, they have an explanation as to where life came from, and of course, more specifically, where humans come from. Now, why does this matter? I mean, why am I even talking about this? Well, it's for that very reason, right? In mythology, everybody talks about how humans came to be, and everybody seems to have that kind of a story. Now, on the surface, I understand that this might not sound interesting. Because the question of, who are we, where did we come from? I mean, that seems to be an intrinsic question for a human to ask, and of course to want an answer for. And your average person will look back on all of these mythologies, and they will think, oh, well, they had the same questions as we do now, and they, for the same reasons as is happening now, instant gratification, they wanted an answer. So they ended up creating some kind of an answer. And of course, the God thing definitely plays a role, because if we look far enough back, we see, the Creator God created everything that you see. The Creator created humans. The Creator created, whatever, right? There's a Creator. And when a Creator is generally spoken about, it's spoken in a way that is very reminiscent of how your average religion looks at a Creator situation. So, for example, modern day we have, Christians and Abrahamic religion type of situation to where, God creates everything, God creates everything and then creates humans in his own image. That's a very mystical approach, right? That's a very metaphysical, weird thing. We can't really quantify that with any real science. It's unfalsifiable. So what has happened, of course, with that, it's obviously unfalsifiable. There's a large amount of people nowadays who will, when they read some kind of a mythological ancient story, they will correlate, the mythical aspect of Abrahamic religion creation to the ancient myths themselves. So whenever they hear the word creator, your average person now just assumes a god, or gods, in the sense of this is a mystical thing. Right? It's not tangible, you can't falsify it, it's just craziness. That actually might be a huge mistake, and I think it is a huge mistake. Because when we actually read the ancient mythologies, and we look at those ancient histories, we don't really find a situation to where they are crediting a metaphysical being with their creation. That doesn't really seem to be the case, and in fact, the further back you go, the older the creation story you can find, the less of that kind of flavor you get. Now, of course, terminologies like the creator are still used, but, this is a modern problem where we take the word creator and we conflate that with the word metaphysical God. This is an issue that we have in the modern times. To put that into context, what I mean is that if you go and you draw a picture, right, you go paint a painting or something, and you hang that up on the wall, and I say, well, who drew this? And then you would say, well, the creator was me. Right? There's no metaphysicalness there, right? It wasn't some crazy god that did it. It was you, flesh and blood. You're right there, and if you wanted to reproduce it for me, technically you could, right? You could get out another canvas, and you could sit there and you could paint more paintings for me to show me that you did that. There's nothing religious about that. There's nothing crazy about that. You are a creator. You created something physical, and you have earned the title creator. So isn't it weird that we do not look at ancient mythology or ancient mythological creators in the sense of them maybe being a real physical being, and instead we look at them as always being some kind of weird metaphysical god? This is a problem that we have when we look at ancient mythology, and it's a pretty common problem. Even if you're open-minded, even if you're pretty open-minded, most people will not look at the term creator and think, oh, wait a second, maybe they actually mean a creator. Maybe there was something physically there creating. And the more you look at the mythologies, the more you look at ancient mythologies, and you start to take that approach, that actually seems to be more and more of the situation. Our ancient ancestors do not appear to be talking about a creator as in the sense of some kind of mystical god. They all seem to be talking about a creator, in the sense of something that was tangible, that was right there, that they could apply credit to. Essentially, what it seems like is that our ancestors are not crediting a metaphysical god. They are simply recording what happened in their history. They say the word creator not because they're trying to talk about a god, but simply because they are trying to say what actually factually happened. Something created life on this planet. Now, I know that's a heavy statement, and I know that can be taken in all kinds of directions, so let me just put a quick warning before I go further. I don't hold any opinion on, where life came from. I don't know any of that. This is an ongoing problem for myself, and as far as I can tell, it is for everybody else. I have not seen a single person with the definitive answer about where life on this planet came from. Now, if you're an evolutionist, let me just cover that really quick. And if you're wondering if I believe in evolution, no, I don't. And the reason why I don't believe in evolution is because evolution doesn't have any real science to support it. And that might sound shocking to some of you out there, because obviously if you live in the Western world, we have been beaten over the head with the evolution is true, situation forever. And we've been made to believe that there's all this science out there for it. But it's very funny when you go and you test evolution for yourself. You go and you apply critical thinking and you apply the scientific methodologies to evolution, and you try to see, hey, okay, what do these guys have from a real scientific level? You find that theory falls apart instantly. And it's amazing how quickly it falls apart. There is literally no evidence to support evolution in the way that it's claimed right now. All of the, I guess you could say, the conclusions that are made by scientists today, it's all conjecture. It's all superficial. There is no actual scientific conclusions that any of these people have been able to reach given the evidence. And the reason why is simple. The evidence doesn't support the conclusion. Ironically, when you look at something like evolution and you look at the evidence, you actually find it's the exact opposite. You actually very quickly discover that evolution is essentially impossible. For example, and I'm not going to belabor the point, I just want to set the stage here. But a lot of people will point to an experiment that was done, I think in the 1950s, 1953, I think, to where they grabbed a whole bunch of chemicals, not a whole bunch, but they took things like methane, ammonia, hydrogen, and water, stuff like that. They put it together and then they zapped it with electricity. And the idea here was to see if you could create amino acids from that particular situation. And ultimately, they found they were able to get some amino acids out of that, and that's fantastic. Right? That experiment itself is great. There's a lot. That's science. That's the kind of science that is no longer done today. But that's science. So that was a good discovery. Here's the problem with that discovery, though. What they did then is they said, well, I mean, obviously, once you have amino acids from this situation, DNA just will magically appear over billions of years. That is right now one of the main experiments that evolutionists use to prove their point. Now, any thinking individual should right now immediately be like, wait. Hold on, what? How did we go from creating a few amino acids to all of a sudden having a human walking around? Right? That doesn't make sense. And you're correct. That doesn't make any sense. But we are not trained to look at the problem like that. Right? We are trained to ignore all the stuff that also needs to continue to happen in between that amino acid being created and then you existing. Right? All of those steps are removed, and the way they get away with removing all of those steps, or at least the attention that your average person who's thinking would look at and question, is they say, well, it happened, 10 billion years ago. And once this is the common tactic that is used everywhere to get rid of people asking questions. Not only do we see this in science all the time, right? We see it in biology, we see it in geology, we see it everywhere, all over the place, astronomy. We also find it in history. When something becomes uncomfortable and people start asking too many questions, all of a sudden, oh, well, that was 1,000 years ago. So, it's like we know, but we don't know, but we can't really prove it. So you can't really ask the question, right? That happens in history all the time. That's a huge scapegoat in modern academia, and people don't even question it. Adding and injecting a lot of time randomly into your theories, it's an amazing way to get away from having to prove parts of whatever your conclusion is. So evolutionists do this all the time. Right? And by evolutionists, I just mean the people in authority. Right? You can still be an evolutionist and acknowledge what I just said, and you should, because it's a real problem. Right? Another thing with evolutionists, just in case you're not aware, right? We're not making DNA in the lab. Right? Nobody has even made RNA, by the way. You need RNA before you get to DNA. Guess how many labs have created RNA? Yeah, 0. No one's creating RNA. So nobody has touched DNA. The problem is that you will see these articles out there or these papers out there that will say, oh yeah, we created X or Y, and oh yes. But then when you go and you look at the paper, what do you find? Well, first of all, more often than not, you find that what they've done is they've started with a complete DNA chain and they remove some parts from it and then try to replace some other parts. That is not creating DNA, right? But the headline will say, whatever created. So people honestly believe that we have this kind of an understanding of life on this planet that we don't. And the beauty of that for the mainstream scientist is that most people will never ask any questions against it. No one will challenge this. And because nobody challenges it, right, they get away with it. Right? And it just continues to compile on itself over the years and the decades and the generations. And eventually, because the authoritative system supports this, it will just become fact, and that's what's happened. So right now, you're mocked if you don't believe in evolution, but it's weird because evolution has no evidence for it. Now, if you want me to jump on religious people, that's just as easy, right? I can't falsify a religious person's perspective. Right? There's nothing I can do. Somebody's going to tell me that God made you. Well, all right, what do you want from me, dude? Okay. They can't prove it, and I can't disprove it. So evolution and religion, literally the exact same thing. Now, for the evolutionist, if you're saying, well, maybe one day we'll get it, and that's fine. Hey, if one day evolutionists do actually have all the evidence required to satisfy the scientific method, to point out that the theory is correct, fine. I don't care. Doesn't bother me. I'm not selling a book, right? I don't make any money off of this either way. I don't care. But what does matter to me is the truth. So when I have two opposing sides, which are essentially wrong, but are the only sides you're allowed to be on, we have a problem in our society. So when we start to look at ancient history, when we start to look at these mythologies, it's very difficult for most people to look at these things with a true objective mindset. And by the way, I'm not claiming that I have that mindset down either. I am trying. Right? This is one of the reasons why I do these terrible shows. Is because I'm trying to remind myself that I have to stay objective. Right? That I have to look at these things from a completely open mindset. And it can be tough. Right? I'm in the exact same boat as everybody else. Right? I am not immune from all of the programming that has gone on in society. I am just as susceptible, and I am still doing all of the same stuff that everybody else is doing. Right, so when we look at something like ancient history, it's difficult. It's difficult to pull yourself away. But, when you start to do that and you start to look at mythologies in a completely different light, everything starts to change. And that's what I want to look at today. And the aspect that I want to look at today is the creation, not the general creation. There's kind of a general creation where, the land is, created and the sky and all of that. I don't mean that. And that can kind of be tied in. But what I'm talking about, or what I want to talk about, is mythologies who talk about the creation of humans. I guess I should also put another warning out here so that everybody understands what we're going to go through here. And I don't know where this is going to end up, by the way. We're just going to talk. We'll see where this takes us. But it's a serious enough situation where we have to talk about it. We have to address the problem as historians, because our ancestors certainly have stories about it, so we can't ignore it. So one of the other things that I'll make clear is that I'm not saying that aliens created us either. I really want everybody to understand that I'm trying to approach this subject without any biases, to the best of my ability. And what you can do, of course, with me is you can try to do this. At the very least, I can show you that perspective, just in case you find yourself hardwired into believing a very particular theory right now. Maybe you can pull yourself out of it a little bit, because what I want from you is I want you to help me figure out what's going on. And I'm not very smart, so I need other people who are much smarter than me to figure this stuff out. All right, so it's because I'm not going to do it. All right, okay. Anyway, so from a historical perspective, the unfortunate situation that we find ourselves in within the historical community, I'll just say, is that generally nobody really focuses on any of these creation myths. Nobody really pays attention to them, and for the reasons why I've already stated. Which is unfortunate, because if our ancestors, they took the time to record something, they took the time to not only record it, but to transmit it down the ages, it's probably important. It's not something that we should take lightly. Unfortunately, it's taken lightly nowadays, right? And it's totally discarded. So let's not do that. Let's not take it lightly. Let's look at the situation from a legitimate, objective, scientific, historical perspective, and let's see what happens. Now, when I say most cultures have some kind of a creation myth, I mean, realistically, it's probably all of them. Another thing to remember, actually, there's a lot of things that we have to talk about, but one of the things that we have to remember is that we do not have all surviving accounts of ancient creation mythologies. Right? Who knows what we've lost? Right? Who knows what's been destroyed? So it's entirely possible, by the way, that every single ancient culture has some kind of a creation story, even if we do not currently have it. Or this brings up another problem with history, is that you might think a culture doesn't have it, and it doesn't initially seem like it, not because it was lost, but because it was folded into another culture that right now we generally believe is unconnected to one another. There's so many problems with all this stuff in history. That's a problem all over history, not just with a creation story. Anyway, so when we look at all these ancient creation stories, we find a very similar story. And the similar story is this. The gods show up, and that in itself is interesting, the fact that gods are showing up at all. Who are these gods? And we'll talk about that. But the gods show up, and they create humans. And then the story begins from there, essentially, right? That's where humanity will begin. Now, that's a very generalized story, but that's what they all are. right? The vast majority of all of the ancient creation stories are just like that. Gods show up, gods create humans. Right off the bat, it's very interesting that cultures all over this planet essentially have the exact same style of the creation mythology for humans. Right? Nobody is being created from right off the bat. Right off the bat, we have a template that is used across the entire planet by cultures everywhere who are not supposed to be in communication with one another, and for some weird reason, everybody creates the same structured mythology. Now, this is a serious problem. This is a serious question, right? And it's a question that scientists and historians completely ignore. Right? How the hell did everybody come to the exact same conclusion? There's no scientific reason why this should be the case. There's nothing. There's no reason why all cultures all over the planet who have all these differences and varieties and environment and who they are, etc., there's no specific reason why this should have been the template. The reality is we should have seen all kinds of crazy creative mythologies created with respect to this topic. We really should have. Why does it have to be a god coming here to create humans? Right? Why? Why not anything else? They could have said anything, right? They could have even said something similar to evolution. Right? They could have looked around if they were making all of this stuff up. One tribe somewhere could have easily just been like, well, you know what? I see monkeys. We kind of look like monkeys. Oh yes, over billions of years, we evolved from monkeys into what we are today. That's an entire possibility, right? There could have been an entire thing with that. That doesn't happen. Right? That doesn't happen anywhere. Nothing happens. Right? Anybody could have made up whatever they wanted. They could have all been smoking crack. They could have been doing whatever local drugs are around, and they could have created any number of insane creation mythologies, but nobody does that. Nobody does anything like that. For some weird reason, everybody follows the exact same archetype. Now, if you look at this from a psychological perspective, it makes no sense. Right? From a purely scientific psychological perspective, I just want to mention some parts of this just to kind of get this out there. One of the excuses that will be made by researchers when they're confronted with this topic is they will say, they will bring out something to the tune of blaming it on collective consciousness. Now, collective consciousness is a weird territory. I'm not saying it doesn't exist. All right, I have no idea what consciousness is, so I'm not going to say anything about it. But one of the excuses, and I'll be honest, it's an excuse. Right? It really is just throwing something at the wall hoping it sticks, is that historians can and do blame this situation on collective consciousness. Because they can say something to the metaphysical tune of, well, it's just kind of the way humans are. Humans are just naturally predicated, for some weird reason, for some biological reason, to create this exact kind of archetypal story. And it's just worldwide. That's just the human animal. This excuse is ridiculous. It's insane. It's one of the more insane excuses that's taken seriously for several different reasons. The first reason is that collective consciousness, that whole situation is not known. All right, I know maybe some people out there think they understand all of it and they've got it locked down and they have a pet theory. I get that. Okay, I know there's people like that. But to those people, I would challenge you to show me 100% evidence that you understand the concept of collective consciousness. Show it. I mean, you must have all of this scientific evidence prepared and ready if you're going to believe something like that. If you do. I'm not really saying anybody does either. But, they're out there. We've got those people right now who have no problem claiming that they completely understand everything about consciousness and they've got it all figured out and their third eye is awakened and all this crazy stuff, and yet they're doing nothing with their life, right? It's those kind of people. The reality is the concept of collective consciousness might have something to it, and I'm fine with that. And maybe we can discuss that on another show. There's no definitive evidence that supports the entire concept of collective consciousness on a level that it needs to be taken completely seriously. It doesn't exist. I realize that you can interpret a lot of things. I realize that you can interpret certain pieces of evidence to be supportive of a collective consciousness situation, but, at the end of the day, it's all still conjecture. The reality is there is nobody who can come to me right now and show me the 100% factual evidence that can be reproduced that proves that humans have a collective consciousness and that this collective consciousness would ultimately culminate into our ancestors creating a very specific archetype for the creation of humanity. That evidence does not exist. Feel free to link it in the comments if you've got it, all right? I hate saying that crap about the comments, but I'm still looking for evidence. So if anybody has that, please link it. And then, of course, I'll analyze it. And then once we start to find all of the holes, then I'll make another video that completely shreds that piece of evidence so everybody can see how horrible that piece of evidence was and to show everybody that we don't know what's going on and that we will begin the hunt. We will hunt for the original poster and we will slay. Collective consciousness is not a good explanation. So I just wanted to get that out there because it's ironic that it's used on both the mainstream side of things and the alternative side. Right? And the reason why it's used is the same excuses that we talked about earlier. It's because you can't prove it. You can say it, it sounds smart, you can attach scientific terms to it, but at the end of the day, if you're challenged on it truly, which I will challenge any of you should you post anything like that, if you truly challenge it, people can always run away and say, well, we don't know everything yet, we're still learning, and, they can cop out. It's the same thing as adding, thousands of years to history. It's a cop-out. So you can just say, well, I don't have the evidence. I can't prove it, bro. We can't do that. You just have to trust me. Right? So collective consciousness, that's not a good situation. On the back of collective consciousness, there's also just that general concept of human psychology just has this universal disposition to do certain things. So if we move away from collective consciousness, we can boil it down to an even simpler concept, to where humans, just for whatever reason, all contain the exact same, meme situation in their DNA, and it just, comes out with everybody as humans progress. So, for example, they'll use this excuse to explain why everybody, blames or creates the gods of thunder. Right? And they all created the same kind of god. And all the gods do the exact same kind of events. And all the stories are basically identical. They'll just say, well, it's just human nature to create a god of thunder who thunders up in the sky. And that's just what they did. And they're just predisposed to creating that kind of a story. And that's the excuse that mainstreamers will use. If you poke them hard enough, they can use that excuse. Now, I'm not saying everybody, and that's definitely not the definitive excuse, but it's one they'll use. Right? So they'll look at the creation mythologies and they will simply say, well, it's just part of human nature. All right? Human nature is just to say that a god created us and then we were here and then, history begins from there. It's a very weird claim. It's very awkward, right? Especially coming from somebody in the mainstream. The alternative side, fine. Right? The alternative side, you're a little more open, you can have a little more fun. It's fine, whatever. Of course, you still need evidence. You can't adhere to a claim without evidence, so don't do that. But to have the mainstream say that, what that shows you is that even the mainstream has no idea what they're talking about. They don't know. They have no clue. And this is one of the reasons why the entire creation mythology situation is ignored, because they don't have an answer. You can press any historian on this stuff, and you will win as long as you ask them for scientific proof of their claims. Once you demand that, they're done, because they don't have it. There's nothing there. Right? They've got nothing. So that's why they don't bring it up. So when they don't bring it up, what that means is that people are learning to not question these kind of aspects of history. People are no longer really looking at the creation mythologies because A, they've been trained to not even look at them, right? No, that stuff is probably barely touched on in any college course. And even if it is, it's, there's like 1 or 2 paragraphs, right? Oh, the Aztecs think that, whatever created us out of clay and blah, 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 whatever, they're crazy. And then they move on to pyramids, right? That's how that mythology goes. And of course, everybody goes along with it, because they've been trained to go along with it. They're not going to ask any questions. Nobody's going to stop and be like, wait, whoa. I mean, this has got to be important to the culture that we're learning. Shouldn't we learn more about their history and what they think happened? Shouldn't we pay attention to what they're talking about? Nobody does that. Right? And for the simple reason is that we've been trained not to do it. And there's other fail-safes in there as well, right? Religion is now deemed crazy. If you believe in it, you're crazy. There's a lot of stigma that is now attached to anything with respect to humans being created. So when it comes to human creation, that's one of our first issues that we have to deal with. Don't let people write off these situations under the guise of something that sounds, either scientific or metaphysical. Don't be satisfied with that answer. Collective consciousness or, inherent, human psychology or whatever they say, those are not good answers, and there's no scientific evidence to support them anyways at the moment, so we don't need them. So we can put those to the side. So let's do that. All right. So the next interesting thing about the stories that we'd have to deal with is that humans are created from a material. This might not sound important, but humans are not just created out of thin air. Basically, all cultures require there to be some kind of a resource to be used to create flesh and blood. Why? Wouldn't it have been easier for these people to have simply said, well, the gods snapped their fingers and now humans are running around like crazy lunatics? Right? That would have been easier. They could have done that. Right? They could have. And I know you can make some arguments that some did, but interestingly enough, those stories don't come until later. Right? It's very important that we remember that I'm trying to stick with the more ancient creation mythologies. As a side note, by the way, I guess we could talk about this really fast. There are creation stories that happen after creation. This is another problem that we have to deal with. Because we have a situation to where humans, are created and there's all this stuff, the ancient stuff that we're talking about. But then, thousands of years later or later on in the history of that culture, you'll find another creation kind of story. Right? So things can get a little confusing. Generally, those secondary creation stories either are just new interpretations of the old ones, and you can generally prove that. You can't definitively always prove it, but you can to a degree here and there. Or the supposed creation story is not talking about the original creation. They're talking about essentially a recreation that goes on after another cataclysmic event happens. So we have to be wary of that stuff. Not all creation myths are identical. They're not all taking place during the same time all the time. And sometimes differentiating them can kind of be annoying. However, if we employ catastrophism, if we employ plasma physics, if we employ real history and chronology, we can sort a lot of that stuff out, generally speaking. I think I've said generally like 4 times in the past 60 seconds. But we can do that. Now, I'm not saying we get 100% success rate. I'll never be able to claim that because the reality is, we just don't have the information required to generate any kind of success rate like that whatsoever. But we can move along, right? We can do some comparative stuff. We can use archaeology and science, etc. And we can come to some interesting conclusions. So just so everybody understands, I'm only focusing on like the ancient creation mythologies. So don't throw things in like, after the Venus event type of a creation. That's not what I'm talking about. We're talking about where humans themselves came from. So those are the kinds of mythologies that we want to look at. Anyway, so cultures everywhere require humans to come from some kind of a resource. Right? That's an interesting observation. Why? Right? Why not? Once again, they could have done anything. They could have snapped the fingers. They could have done anything they wanted to. Right? They literally could have. But no. To create a human requires physical resources. Now, that's a very scientific statement because it's a true statement. Right? You need to have some kind of a raw material to produce a product. That's very basic manufacturing, right? You need a supply chain. You need material to create. And it seems like everybody in the ancient past very much understood this. And they understood that it was intrinsic to the human animal, to the human being created. And yeah, I get it. You can make the claim that what I just said is obvious, that you need something to build something else. That is an obvious statement. And of course, our ancestors would have been perfectly capable of understanding that. But it's not a requirement. There's no reason for everybody to have required there to be some kind of a basic substance that humanity would have eventually been created out of. The fact that we don't find all kinds of crazy stories all over the planet is interesting. Right? The reason why I'm even belaboring this point is because this is one of those basic data points that we can extrapolate out of mythology. And it's a data point that a lot of people will discard as useless because it's so obvious on the surface. But if we think about it for, longer than 3 seconds, what we find is that all of our ancestors could have come up with any wacky excuse for human creation that they wanted. I mean, anything. The sky's the limit. Whatever influences they had back in the day that we don't even know nowadays, they could have used that stuff. And they would have. Right? There's a probability that a lot of the explanations would have come from areas that don't make any sense to us now because we simply don't have a reference point, whether it be culturally or anything else really that existed during the time that they existed that we do not have any reference for now. Does that make sense? You know what I'm saying? But we don't find that. Instead, what we find is a very basic, down-to-earth, scientific explanation as to how you could create something. And yes, I realize that the substances that are described in these creation stories actually do kind of go on to the crazier side of things. So, actually we run into a weird conundrum. Because on one hand, we have our ancestors describing, possibly a scientific way to create life, to create something. You need some base materials. There's a process, there is a creator that uses a process, and then out pops humans. Of course, on the other side of these stories, you have, some kind of a crazy sounding god using some weird materials, and out pops a human. And there's not really any technology talked about in any of these stories. And yeah, I know we can talk about maybe a few kinds of creation mythologies, and we will, that might deal with technology. But otherwise, it's essentially a god that comes down and uses, crazy materials. And some of these materials are not exactly what you and I in the modern age, it's not something we would generally consider using to create a human. So for example, if we look over there in Greek and Chinese mythologies, even Hebrew and Egyptian, they talk about humans being crafted from, clay or mud, right? If we go over to the Mayan, they talk about people being produced from corn. At least corn has some life substance there, but, it's still kind of weird. Other cultures, the Maya as well, but like the Norse and the Slavic cultures, they describe humans being created from, wood or trees or plants. Right? So if you look at the Norse mythology, the first man and the first woman are made from trees. And in their case, it would be the ash and the elm tree. Over there in the Slavic areas, some of their myths, not all of them, and this is going to be a caveat everywhere. But they have humans being carved out of wood by gods and spirits. And if we look over at Southeast Asia, we find some creation mythologies will talk about some kind of a cosmic egg. All right. Now, the cosmic egg situation is taken incorrectly. Now that I think about it, I was just bringing it up because I'm just listing off some concepts of which cultures, or whatever base material that cultures used to create humans. But really quick, as a side note, this cosmic egg situation, they quite literally mean a cosmic egg. They're not talking about some kind of a magical egg that was sitting here on Earth and a god picked up and turned into a human or something like that. This story is actually referencing the Saturnian breakup. Because the cosmic egg would have been essentially that shell they would have seen at a very specific time during the breakup that would have looked like an egg, because you would have had this, the plasma sphere would have been it would have been lighted up. The plasma sheath around Saturn as it's being torn apart would have been visible. Let's put it like that, right? And at a certain point, you would have seen part of that sheath elongated maybe towards the top or the bottom due to the electrical environment. It would not have stayed a perfect sphere. It would have started to warp. And this warping would have looked like an egg for a certain period of time. I'm kind of digressing, but it's actually important to mention, because the cosmic egg story of creation is the exact kind of mythology that we are not discussing today. Because the cosmic egg was literally something they saw in the sky, and that's not where humans came from. Humans did not form from a cosmic egg. That is a poor interpretation of a creation mythology by modern mythologists, and potentially even, modern Southeast Asian religions and stuff. Right? If their tradition was not handed down well enough, and if it was not preserved well enough, it gets skewed as well. And of course, they're just as susceptible to Western academia and all of their mentalities as anybody else. Right? That's actually a common problem, to where you will have local populations who have a good story, but the story doesn't really make sense in the context of a Western understanding of history and science. So what happens is that over time, that Western influence will affect the locals' perception of their history, and eventually they will lose the true meaning. And I'm willing to bet that that is exactly what has happened with this cosmic egg situation. All right, so anyway, cosmic eggs are not the creation mythologies that we're talking about. Anyway, so the materials we just kind of covered are materials that are not generally thought of when we are thinking about creating life. Right? We don't generally think that, we need some clay and some mud if we are going to create, a human. We're not generally thinking like that. It gets a little better when you start looking at other life. So for example, they're carving, or multiple stories have humans being created from, say, wood. At least wood is an organic substance, but, still, it gets a little weird. Do you really need wood as a base, product to create a human? I would say no, I don't think that's required, but it's there. Now, things get more interesting when we look at other components of creation stories, where we get into things that are a little more genetic. So, for example, if we look at something like, the Babylonians or the Aztecs, they believe that blood from the kings, or the gods, I should say, blood from the gods mixed with mud would create new humans. Right? So that's where you get a lot of that blood sacrifice stuff from. And there's a lot of other reasons for the sacrifices. That's a whole history in and of itself. And it's a messed up one, man. The whole sacrifice thing, it's crazy. Okay, anyway. So blood. Now, blood is interesting because from a genetic sense, blood has DNA in it. And this is maybe where we're starting to get closer to the truth. Maybe the stories that talk about using blood might be closer to a scientific reality. So when they say that the gods took their blood, and mixed it with other earthly materials, now we have a potential scientific path. Now, obviously, the story is not, breaking down CRISPR, and it's not going through gene editing, and there's nothing like that in any of these stories. The stories are still basic. But from a scientific genetic perspective, having some blood from from some kind of a human that we want to clone is going to be helpful. All right, so maybe there's something to those Babylonian or Aztec mythologies. Another thing, or the Aztecs will also mention bones. They'll use bones from past human beings. And interestingly enough, those past humans that are in the Aztec mythology, or at least the bones that are used from those past humans, those guys are considered from the underworld, right? And they're revived using what is considered divine blood. So what the hell does that mean? Right? That's a whole other thing in and of itself. And once again, if we contextualize it within the scope of, genetics, and you throw in some sort of a technology that can manipulate it, is it possible that that story is referencing a creator using older creations to create a new kind of human, out of the scraps? Yeah, I mean, I don't know, but it's there. It's very interesting. There's no real reason to have that story, by the way. Like, why would the Aztecs make up a story like that? It's such a weird thing to make up. Right? There's this whole weird backstory that has to exist for modern humans to exist. And that's a common thing, by the way. Right? If we start looking over, and I know a lot of you guys are thinking of ScHIzo. I'll talk about ScHIzo in a second. But it is a common mythology to where when you deal with creation of life, specifically humans, you find a situation to where you have several failed creations until we get to a point to where humans exist, more or less as how we exist now. And that's a very common situation all over the planet as well. Right? We'll talk about that in a sec. Anyway, but when we start to look at these other creation stories, they start to inject biological material that would be required, or could be useful, I should say, into creating a new kind of human. And then, of course, some of the stories go a little further. Right? We have some stories, and say like the Vedas, to where humans literally come from dismembered Purusha, right? A cosmic being. What the hell does that mean? Right? Now, anytime we hear the word cosmic, or we start to hear about anything in space, we gotta kind of put the brakes on and approach it like we did the cosmic egg. Right? Did the Vedas really describe the dismembered parts as being for humans, or was it for a different kind of creation? Right, so that can get a little tricky. Right? Once again, the Aztecs are over there, and they're over there. The Aztec gods are using their own life force, or body parts in some cases, in the creation process. Right? The Norse have something similar. Right? We have the first giant's body who, comes down from the cosmos. And apparently, gods make humans from the trees that come out of this whole story. Now that story gets a little weird, and that's probably, now that I think about it, alright, so we do have to be careful when we talk about stuff like that. So for example, the Norse will say that everything comes out of that first giant's body. That's probably some kind of a cosmic event that affects Earth, and I don't know, maybe the creators, whoever the hell they were, used parts of that. I don't know, that gets weird. Now that I think about it, I don't know. We'll stay away from that for right now. And then, of course, the last substance that people or the cultures would blame on creation will be water. And sometimes they'll use sea foam or dew. Now, when we find cultures like Egypt, for example, who start to talk about the cosmic waters, that is where creation comes from, that would also be cosmological in origin. So the reason why I call out all of these materials is so that we can differentiate between what was used to create humans and versus what was used just to create, if that makes sense. We're just trying to focus on humans. I'm not worried about all the other creation mythologies. But these are the differences that we have to be aware of. So if we look at all the materials that I just listed, things like blood and bone become the most interesting ones. And they're the most interesting ones for the obvious reason. They would contain genetic information. So, at this point, we now are inevitably going to have to deal with ScHIzo. Now, I am not a fan of ScHIzo. I'll just be straight up about that. The reason why I'm not a fan of ScHIzo is very simple. If you look at ScHIzo from a purely objective, scientific perspective, you very quickly find that ScHIzo was pushing what he wanted to believe. Now, ScHIzo is a whole 10 million shows in and of himself. Well, you could probably get away with one, really. But for those of you who don't remember Sitchin or don't know who he is, basically Zecharia Sitchin went and he started translating all the Sumerian texts he could find. And I give him credit for that. He went out, learned it, and tried to get all those translations going. So that's actually good history. So credit to Sitchin on that. So it's not that I hate Sitchin. It's just that Sitchin is one of those guys who falls into the psychological problem of starting to drink your own Kool-Aid. Right? Especially when you start to get a little notoriety. What do you want? You want more notoriety. So you'll start to do things maybe that will gain you more notoriety, even though those things maybe should not have been done. So while Sitchin is over there translating Sumerian texts, he will start to take a lot of liberties with his translations. And ultimately what Sitchin will produce is he will come up with an explanation that there were basically aliens that came down to Earth and genetically created humans. Right? That's the very basics of it. I don't want to go too far with it. Because like I said, that's a whole other show and we'd spend the next 12 years here. But we have to acknowledge him. Anyway, so Sitchin's concept isn't scientifically wrong. And I don't even necessarily disagree with it. The problem is that Sitchin took so many liberties, and he also fell into the trap of relating those translations to modern understandings of science. So what I mean by that is that Sitchin makes no new fresh discoveries. He doesn't bring out any new information about how genetics works or how life works. He very much translates all of his stuff relative to the knowledge of genetic engineering during his lifetime. And this is one of the major pitfalls that you have to watch out for when you're reading, so-called alternative science or history. The biggest red flag you will find is when somebody has a theory and they're pushing it and they're getting, popularity. But what's interesting is that theory doesn't actually predict anything. It doesn't do anything new. All it does is rolls along with modern scientific understanding. So what that shows you is that person is just grabbing what they can see that's scientific, and they're injecting it into their theory to make their theory work. And of course, by doing that, you give it perceived accountability. Because of course, it's lining up with what modern science has made discoveries on. So yeah, this sounds good, right? You've got some scientific backing, and your average person will not understand what the problem is. Right? Because they're so enamored by modern science, and they think that modern science has basically everything figured out, when the reality is, especially when it comes to genetics, we don't have anything figured out. Like, we are so far behind in knowing and understanding DNA that it's hilarious. It's absolutely insane. There's so many problems. But Sitchin's translations rolls along with what is known at the time. So for example, like I said, Sitchin makes no predictions. Sitchin shows us nothing new. Now, that doesn't necessarily mean that it's all wrong, but it's a problem. It gets even worse, of course, because when you look at his translations, you start to find a lot of discrepancies, and you start to find the liberties that he took. Right? And it sucks, because had Sitchin not done that, he would have been taken more seriously, and he may have done better work, actually. And so that's the problem with Sitchin. However, the concept is not incorrect. That's basically what I've been alluding to this entire time. And that's essentially what our ancestors have been describing. Right? Ultimately, at the end of the day, regardless of whatever I believe, or whatever Sitchin believes, or whatever, the mythologies are what they are. I didn't create them. Right? These are the histories. Humans appear to be created for a purpose, even, which is also interesting. And, they're created by another pre-existing being, which, interestingly enough, is more often than not, just a regular physical form. Yes, it's more often than not described as a powerful form, absolutely. But it is not some kind of crazy metaphysical god thing that nobody can understand. It actually gets even crazier when you start to read the mythologies deeper, Because the way the ancient mythologies talk about the creators is they talk about them very much in a mortal sense. Right? We have all of these creators not only doing scientific things like creating life, genetically maybe creating humans. Technically nothing weird about that. You could do it. But we also find a situation to where the creators are dealing with drama. The creators are dealing with emotions. The creators tend to be dealing with regular human kinds of things. And what they have to deal with absolutely affects the history. You find creators being killed by one another. Right? It's a real situation. Creators bleed. The creators are described as doing very normal biological animal stuff. The same kind of stuff that you and I deal with every day. There's nothing mystical about it. The only crazy thing is the way that it appears what they were doing back in the day, right? Creating humans. That's a crazy thing. So, for example, if we look at something like the Enuma Elish, right? We have Enki, who the modern mainstream considers, some kind of mystical god. He comes down and he creates humans for what purpose? He doesn't create humans for some kind of a crazy god reason that's all, amazing and metaphysical. No, he creates humans to simply serve the gods. And not only just serve the gods, there's a reason why. They need labor. It's a very basic concept. It's why we build robots, right? It's the same, it's literally the exact same concept. There's nothing religious or mythical about this concept. If you have the technology to build something that will help you progress, this is what humanoid life does. And this is exactly what Enki does. Right? There's nothing crazy about what he does. It's a very, very basic concept. Have I said that enough? Very basic concept. I honestly believe that is one of the major amazing aspects to all of these mythologies all over the world. Humans are not created for some kind of a glorious reason. Humans are created for a very down-to-earth reason. If we look at the Enki situation, if Enki is a god in the sense of how, modern people think of a god, why the hell does he need to create humans to do some, slave labor? Like, what is this? If you're a god, it should not be a problem. It's the standard, atheist argument against anybody who's religious. Why is a god creating humans at all if he's just omnipotent and literally everything? There's no reason for it. It's a problem. However, if your quote-unquote god is a flesh and blood being, whatever the hell it is, suddenly this makes sense. Suddenly there might be other reasons why you would create, a human or a lesser human, depending on how you want to look at it. If you need stuff done and you have the technology, there you go. You just do it. It's not a problem. And it makes sense. This basic idea is what has been lost, for sure, in the mainstream, and what has been twisted in the alternative mainstream. Because now we either have, all the mythologies are 100% fiction and there's nothing to it, or we have crazy aliens came down and they had 10, arms and big eyes and flying around in flying saucers with teleports and blah, blah, blah. And they were creating humans and, both sides are too crazy. There's no reason to do either. If we just listen to the mythologies themselves and we take them at face value to the best of our ability, suddenly these mythologies start to make more sense in a grounded way. Now, of course, this will, it changes everything relative to how the mainstream looks at life, evolution, and stuff like that. And it also, it also changes how religious people would look at stuff. I mean, could you imagine if all the Christians and Muslims suddenly discovered that, no, God did not create you. Some other being, that you can see, touch, and feel, and maybe even kill is the thing that created you. What kind of psychological havoc would that have on the planet? That would be a very interesting thing to see. I mean, that'd be crazy. And then, of course, if you look at the mainstream side, right, suddenly evolution goes right out the window. Right? Evolution is gone. Chronology, 100% wrong. A lot of sciences that we thought we had locked down are suddenly proved incorrect. even though a lot of them have already been scientifically proved incorrect, but whatever. Right? Everything changes. So it's funny, both sides of the coin who are not looking at the mythologies in the correct manner have a lot to lose if they do. And that's one of the main reasons why we're not seeing that. That's one of the main reasons why stuff like what I'm talking about here, just very basic, right? I haven't gone into anything crazy, and I won't, because I think we're almost at an hour or whatever. But even us just looking at the basics of the mythology and just trying to tease out even the most basic observational data points, is essentially not allowed on either the religious or the atheist community, or the science, or the mainstream science, or the alternative science. You're not allowed to do that because way too many uncomfortable truths immediately become present. One of the things that a lot of people don't realize, especially with the alternative community, is that the alternative community believes a lot of the same trash that the mainstream does, which is ironic. Right? They believe in ice ages still. They believe in black holes. They believe in dark matter and dark energy, right? The alternative mainstream is more than happy to believe all of that. Hell, they even basically believe in the modern mainstream chronology. So even the alternative side has a ton to lose should any of this prove to be true. So nobody looks at it. Right? Nobody wants to pay attention to it. But we're going to do it. We're going to keep going. I mean, not right now because I'm tired of talking and we need to move on with life. But this is the problem. Like this is the issue. It's not just a mainstream issue, right? It's both sides. So what we need to do is we need to boil down these mythologies and start just looking at the basics. We don't need to jump in with any kind of perceived, theory. In fact, do this. If you have a theory about how stuff is going, just get rid of it. Just throw it out the window. For fun. I'm not saying completely get rid of it. But as an intellectual exercise, just get rid of anything you've got. And pick 3 or 4 different mythologies, as old as you can find them. Right? Older creation mythologies. And now look at it objectively. Just listen to what these people are talking about. You're going to start to find the stuff that we've talked about here. You're going to find that there are multiple kinds of creation stories, and these creation stories happen at different points in chronology. You are going to find that the creation stories themselves are dealing with entirely different kinds of topics. You're going to have biological, very purely scientific biological creation stories. And you're also going to find creation stories to where essentially time begins. And those will generally deal with cosmological aspects, plasmatic aspects, electricity, etc. Not necessarily related to one another. So don't fall into that trap. I hope I kind of outlined it a little bit. Yeah, it's something we could talk about. We'll talk about it more later. So if you can approach these mythologies with an open mind and just listen to what's being said, see if you can't map out entirely new angles that these things might be representing. I guarantee you'll find it. You might be the one that makes the discovery. You might be the one that makes the correlation. And then link it to me so that I can see it. Because we're missing a lot. One of the problems with a lot of these ancient stories is that if, they're translations of translations. Right? Like I'm not reading Polynesian. I'm not reading Rongo. I'm not doing any of that. So this stuff gets tough. But that does not mean that there aren't people out there who aren't either doing it or aren't close to it. We just have to find them. Right? And see if we can't tease out what these mythologies are truly talking about. Now I'm just wasting time talking. Okay, you guys get it. Okay.